Okay, so this is going to be a direct continuation of the last couple of pages in the second chapter in Mircea Eliade's The Forge and the Crucible, Origins and Structures of Alchemy. It's about the mythology of the Iron Age, and we're talking about the spiritual consequences in our unrestrained use of metals. And what Eliade wants to talk about here is a particular ethnographic transition from when we started to use metals, like the Iron Age. So this is around, let's say, 1200 BC, something like that. And we're talking about changes in our sort of spiritual universe, sacred canopy, and mythology that took place around that time. And what he wants to say is that, um, yeah, there was this sort of the one God, the original heavenly God, who was quite still present in the ethnological phases of food gathering and small game hunting, is finally ousted by the strong God, the fertilizing male spouse of the terrestrial Great Mother. I gave the example from Greek mythology that I happen to know, which is that, like we're talking about the moment when Zeus, who wields a lightning bolt, right, and his 12 Olympians, he overthrows Kronos, his father, the god of time, and then rules Olympus. And so I'm saying that there's this particular shift in our in spiritualities that occurred as a result of particular technological changes when we started to use metals a whole lot more. Because think about that god, that Zeus that I just mentioned, right? He's a classical storm god. He like they wield, like Thor is another example. He wields a hammer, right? It's a kind of smithing kind of archetype. Um, it's very different than the kinds of mythology and spirituality that came before that point. The consequence is a greater kind of duality in our spiritual systems, in our beliefs, and not just beliefs, where there's more of a duality between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother. I'll leave that there and then continue from the point that I left off, where Eliade says, it is known, of course, that on this religious plane, the conception of a creatio ex nihilo, or creation from nothing, the conception of a creation from nothing, accomplished by a supreme heavenly deity, has been overshadowed and superseded by the idea of creation by hierogamy and blood sacrifice. We pass from the idea of creation to that of procreation. Okay, so this has to do with our beliefs in the origin. How did anything come to exist? Well, there's a certain spiritual model of that, of creation, which is that things just came to be, whether it's a big bang that's like things were created out of nothing, bang, and then now there's everything. That's what science says. And or different versions of that where it's God who has literally created all this from nothing in a single instant or over 6 days or however long. There's a different kind of mythology than the mythology associated with procreation rather than creation. So there's a way that this mythology of creation from nothing, the Latin creatio ex nihilo, is very different than a procreative and sexual kind of myth of the origins or cosmogony. And so he feels that this shift, look, because when we shift our tool making, right? So that instead of using stone tools, we start to use a whole lot more metal tools. We also shift our spiritual universe. We worship different gods. We worship different kinds of gods, as I was saying about this duality between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother rather than the one heavenly God, right? And it's not only that, but our mythology and spirituality associated with where we came from and how all this came to be here also shifts. And it shifts in this particular way that he's identifying, that we understand that things are not just created from nothing in a single moment, but they're procreated in a sexual way. So the mythologies and spiritualities talk about how the relationship between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother gives rise to, in a procreative way, everything. For this is one of the reasons why, in the mythology of metallurgy, we come up against the motifs of ritual union and blood sacrifice. I'm going to try to unpack this. It's not quite clear from this point. I'll keep going just to say that because of this emphasis on procreation rather than creation, and hierogamy or like sacred union, there's a renewed or new emphasis on ritual union as a mythological motif, and apparently on blood sacrifice as well. It's not quite clear why from here, but again, I'll keep going. He says, it's important to grasp the significance of the novelty represented by the idea that creation is effected or brought about by immolation or self-immolation. Immolation it refers to the act of killing or destroying something, usually through fire, often as a profound sacrifice or offering. It's a kind of it's a ritualized form of self-destruction. Yeah. So I talked about this in episode 3 in this series, Alchemy to the Depths, the significance of self-destructiveness, and how it can be taken literally as suicide, or it can be taken symbolically as the death and rebirth motif, which is essentially the core of mythology. So what we're coming to see here is that there is a transition in our mythology, in our spiritual universe, that gave a new significance to ideas associated with the proper, I would say, the proper practice of, in a sense, self-sacrifice. So there are ritual practices that allow us to understand and embody the practice of sacrificing ourselves in such a way that that which is old and no longer needed can be shed, transformation can occur, and rebirth, resurrection can come about. And this new understanding was reflected in our mythology in such a way that we understand that creation is brought about by immolation. And we enacted that. In the form of drama, in the form of ritual, in the form of religious practice, if not in explicit understanding. Eliade states, previous mythologies know only of a creation from nothing, or from some primordial substance fashioned by God. Quote, the making of the blood sacrifice into a condition of creation, cosmogony, origins of the universe, as well as anthropogeny, origins of man. So the making of the blood sacrifice into a condition of the creation of the universe, as well as the creation of mankind, reinforces not only the homologies between man and the cosmos, but it introduces as well the idea that life can only be engendered from another life that has been immolated. So that was a lot, wasn't it? This sentence has to do with the idea that there's a common notion in this mythological sense of the origins of the universe and the origins of mankind, humankind. And so it's sort of the idea that only death can pay for life, but it's not exactly that. It's more like what we're talking about is a religious or spiritual understanding that certain kinds of sacrifice are a condition of creation. He just says these kinds of cosmogony and anthropogeny, myths of the origin, they have considerable consequences. The stage will be reached where creation or fabrication will be inconceivable without previous sacrifice. during building rites, for example, the life or soul of the victim is transferred into the building itself. The building becomes the new body, structurally speaking, of the sacrifice victim. So yeah, it's really difficult to because we sort of say, hey, we don't want to do human sacrifice anymore, and blood sacrifice is kind of icky and kind of primitive and like wrong, right? And the idea is, yes, we're not taking this literally exactly. We're taking it symbolically. So the whole point being that we're talking about a particular stage in culture that arose as a result of the adoption of particular new technologies that had an effect on our sense of our own origins and what is required for the act of creating something, where we started to understand in a new way the importance, the centrality of sacrifice to there's a link here between letting go of that which is to be sacrificed to facilitate the creation of the new. And the core of that is really die and become. The core of that is the myth of rebirth. But it was reflected in things, for example, like I guess you could say primitively, although it's a little bit, I mean, I don't know, it kind of seems primitive to me to just like kill or burn someone when you're creating a new building. So I don't know, however you want to relate to it, this kind of a new understanding was reflected in practices where, for example, um, you know, hey, we're building a building, well, we better sacrifice a victim to sort of honor the gods to go along with that. Well, it's like maybe we don't want to take that literally, but there is in fact something to that because we do have to let go of that which is precious or valuable in order to really create something new. Okay, so I moved inside to preserve my battery, and it's a different moment in time. So what I'm going to do is we'll finish the next page. So from here, we've been exploring again, like changes in our in mythologies, historically speaking, and in our spiritual universe, our sense of the origin of things, the origin of ourselves, that go along with adoption of certain new technologies for working with metal tools, smithing, mining, and so on. And I feel that, yeah, like we discussed, for example, the difference between a myth of the origins associated with creation to a myth of the origins associated with procreation. So an example of the first kind of myth is the Big Bang. Like everything, the universe is created out of nothing in a single moment. Whereas a mythology associated with procreation is more like that there is a kind of divine union between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, and their union produces the human world. It's a mythological view of the origins shared by, in different forms, by many cultures. And part of this has to do with what I feel is part of the difference that I'll just set to the side is the difference which I've sort of been working with this quote, one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. And I feel that the first section there, like myths of the origin that have to do with creation from nothing, kind of have to do with one become two. And whereas, what do I mean by that? There's like a multiplicity which emerges from a unity. One becomes two. It's that kind of idea. Whereas if you already have two, such as the Sky Father and the Great Mother, the Earth Mother, then their divine union, hierogamy, is productive of something more, namely a third. From two becomes three. I won't go into that anymore. We'll continue with Eliade, who we've been speaking about. There's a homology, which is kind of like a shared archetype that has to do with the myths of our own origins and the myths of the origins of the universe. So the idea is that there is an archetype which is influencing our sense of our own origins and the origins of the universe, such that we see or notice a homology between them. It has to do with the idea of sacrifice, which we obviously see in some sense fulfilled or culminated in Christ. It has to do with the mythology underlying a certain kind of creativity, a certain kind of creation. It has to do with the idea that in order to create something new, you essentially have to let something go. You have to give something up. We saw this expressed in ritual practice, religious practice. The idea is that there is a historically underappreciated in like we don't appreciate as much as we could the significance of that idea and what it could mean to us. So Eliade gives several examples that I'll go through briefly because then he tries to lay out what's significant about this. So he says, it's a kind of now a classic example. From the body of the sea monster Tiamat, whom he has vanquished, Marduk creates the universe. That's a Babylonian creation myth. Similar themes are found elsewhere. In Germanic mythology, the giant Ymir constitutes primal matter, as do Anku and Purusha in Chinese and Indian mythology. Okay. Purusha signifies man, showing indeed that human sacrifice filled a cosmogonic function in certain Indian traditions. So what he's talking about is like different mythological threads that each express in a different way this common idea that something about human sacrifice, and I don't literally mean like sacrifice of humans, although it was taken literally to mean that at different points. It's something symbolic. It's the idea of that by investing something like energy, for example, by giving up something important, there is a world creating effect that has. Myths that has to do with myths of Genesis, myths of origin, myths of cosmogony, the creation of the universe. Court. But such a sacrifice was the prototype, as it were. The immolated human victim embodied the divine primordial micanthrope. So he's literally talking about like rituals and rites where a human was sacrificed, which I think I would understand to be kind of sort of they sort of took something too literally that I'm understanding to be symbolic ultimately. But there's an idea that when that kind of an act or a process occurs on a human scale, it embodies the same principle at a divine level. So there's a way that, in a way, in a sense, God sacrifices himself by being in matter. And so by imitating that quality, by embodying it, humans can connect with that aspect of God. Quote, it was always a god that was sacrificed, a god represented by a man. This symbolism springs not only from mythological traditions associated with the creation of man, but also from myths concerned with the origin of elementary plants. So it's quite tricky to draw out the meaning of these threads. So I'm going to come back to the thing about plants in a minute when he talks about that in greater depth. The emphasis here is on a certain kind of creativity or that has to do with the creation of the origins of something. It's a kind of creativity that gives birth to a world, that gives birth to you could say humankind, but it's humankind and their world. And it's that kind of creativity which is it's procreative. It's not just creative. And procreative is here understood in such a way that it's connected with the mythology of death and rebirth, with sacrifice, by which I mean one has to give something up in order for something new to emerge. And so, in terms of our attitude, it has to do with an attitude of devotion, that only by devoting ourselves to a certain process, that giving one's attention, giving one's time and energy as if one were giving a precious gift. This is a kind of sacrifice, right? It's a kind of investment or investiture that makes possible a certain kind of emergence, a certain kind of creativity. So he gives the example from, again, Babylonian creation myth, the same one. To create man, Marduk immolates himself, literally like destroys himself in a certain sense. Quote, I shall, and this is from Marduk, right, in the Babylonian creation myth. I shall make my blood solid. I will make bones therefrom. I shall raise up man. Indeed, man will be. I shall construct man, inhabitant of the earth. So here, Marduk is regarded as a kind of god who performed a certain kind of self-sacrifice to then incarnate in a way as man, to give rise to man. And so imagine this, right? Imagine that we are in fact the gods. Imagine that the awareness that we are is presented with an opportunity to recognize itself as deity or deities. Again, monotheism and polytheism lie in that direction. I'm not distinguishing them for the moment. If we can see that opportunity, we can recognize ourselves as God, right? Is it also possible to recognize from there that in a way, this is in a sense the original identity? And that when there's a way that we've gone through a process of self-forgetting. We've forgotten who we are. And that, like, is it possible to see ourselves in that light? Can we know about ourselves? Ah, we've forgotten who we are. So what I'm saying is that our identity, our identification as human beings is actually a consequence, is actually a product of a certain kind of misrecognition. As in, when we incarnated, when we dropped into these lives, these bodies, these identities, we forgot who we were. And that's deeply important. It's not just about, like, there are reasons for that. So that we have this, again, investment. It's a sacrifice process. It's a sacrificing of who we truly are for the sake of being here, for giving ourselves in service to these lives, these bodies, these identities, and this matter, this creation. And I'm understanding through the stuff about theurgy as well, which is like a metaphysics that gives a positive view of matter and of embodiment. It's actually only possible, like the whole purpose, in a sense, like the reason for that sacrifice, right? The reason for that self-forgetting process is so that we are, in fact, and can be invested in these identities, these lives, these bodies, because it is by means of this incarnation that we can facilitate, as per human purpose, right, the manifestation of divinity within matter. So humans are possessed of a capacity. We have this capacity to allow the gods to be present. And we have to have forgotten who we are in order to facilitate that. So I'll continue from there, but I'll just mention a couple of other small things on the side, which is that what I've connected here with this, it's a particular branch of mythology associated again with adoption of particular technologies in the Iron Age and so on. What we connected was not only myths of the origin connected with procreation, two becomes three, but that there's a link between self-sacrifice and death and rebirth, which is essentially the core of mythology in a way. This death and rebirth myth is like pretty much the most important and most widespread or universal. Obviously, not the only one. I'm not saying that that's what all mythology is, but there's something really crucial and essential about these mythologies of death and rebirth associated with transformation, our capacity to die and become, die and become. And self-sacrifice is connected to that, as represented, for example, in this story told by Marduk. He's like, oh, I'm going to immolate myself, whatever, and this is going to give rise to a certain kind of creativity, certain kind of cosmogony, certain kind of creation of the world of mankind. Another kind of practical example of that sort of thing would be, again, the stories, the mythology associated with psychedelia. As in, I'm going to use the example from Dune. So Frank Herbert's Dune. Um, in that story, I mean, spoilers if you haven't read or seen Dune. So Paul Atreides, who's the hero, is really concerned because after his ascent to power, like actually, sorry, before his ascent to power, he's concerned because of visions of a spiritual war that rages across the universe fought in his name, and he doesn't want to be the creator of that kind of destruction. And so what he does is he realizes that he needs to receive further visions. And so what he does is he goes to the uh, sort of temple of the Fremen, the desert people whom he calls his sort of adopted family. And he voluntarily chooses to drink a kind of it's kind of like an ordeal poison, which is from this is like when you eat or drink a substance which sort of takes you to the edge of death, but then it doesn't kill you, or it does, and then it's like you die and come back to life kind of thing. And then so he voluntarily chose to do that. It's a kind of self-sacrifice for the sake of receiving sort of psychedelically induced visions um, that that show him the way, roughly speaking. So his what I'm saying is that in that story, his willingness to sort of sacrifice himself and his old life in order to receive visions was linked to his capacity to die and be reborn and lead the way, essentially, and not give rise to jihad. So now let me try and finish off this chapter with the remaining couple of paragraphs from Eliade, who says, again, it's a little tricky. He says, he speaks of an author named King, who was the first to translate the Babylonian creation myth that we were discussing. And he said, this guy, King, sought to link the story with the Mesopotamian tradition of creation, which was handed down by Berosus from the 4th century, quote, who says, quote, and Bel, seeing that the earth was deserted but fertile, commanded one of the gods to cut off his head, to mix his blood with the earth, and to fashion men and animals capable of supporting the air. So it's just like another example of this kind of myth of the origins, that there's a process of the self-sacrifice of a deity to give rise to a particular kind of creativity. Eliade states, similar cosmological notions are to be found in Egypt. The profound sense of all these myths is clear enough. Creation is a sacrifice. Creation is a sacrifice. One can put life into what one has created only by giving to it one's own life. Blood, sweat, and tears, sperm, soul, etc. By investing one's life in something, uh, one gives rise to a certain kind of creation. Let's keep going here. He says, this is where I get back to the thing about plants. He said, yet another series of myths which are morphologically connected with this theme speak of the origin of elementary plants, which basically refer to plants that are edible, that are cultivated and gathered for human consumption. Um, so the myths of the origin of such plants have to do with that they issued from the self-sacrifice of a god or goddess. So this isn't just about the origins of mankind, it's about the origins of the earth. So imagine that the Earth Mother sacrifices herself to incarnate as all these amazing crops, which we can then harvest and consume for our own life. He says, quote, to ensure the existence of man, a divine being, woman, girl, man, or child, is sacrificed, and from his or her body sprout the different kinds of nutritive plants. This myth provides the model for the rites which must be periodically celebrated. So this is the kind of theme here. It has to do with the relations between humankind and the earth, where it's sort of understood that God expressed as the Sky Father sacrifices himself so as to incarnate as the beings which are called human. And on the other hand, the God expressed as Earth Mother sacrifices herself to incarnate as literally as matter and all these plants which we can then eat. And so these are like two halves of this is like humans and our plants and our relations with matter. They incarnate or embody or imitate a spiritual process or the same kind of archetypal significance expressed at a spiritual level or transcendent level. And again, he also said this myth provides the model for the rites which must be periodically celebrated, meaning this is a myth of the origins which is also expressed practically. It's something that it's a notion of our own origins and our origin and the origins of the universe that we ritually maintain, or in fact that we fail to do so. Meaning when we forget the rites and rituals that are associated with this kind of cosmogony and anthropogony, then we forget who we are. We forget who we are and we forget the origins of the earth. And that literally profanes us. It literally profanes the world because it puts us really out of touch with the sacred significance of who we are and the sacred significance of the world. Quote, this is the significance of the human sacrifices made for the benefit of the harvest crops. The victim is put to death, cut up, and the pieces strewn over the earth to make it fertile. As we shall see later, according to certain traditions, metals are also supposed to have issued from the flesh or blood of some immolated primordial semi-divine being. Perhaps a not so friendly one. The point there being that human sacrifices or blood sacrifices, like horrible as we now regard them to be, part of the benefit of that kind of practice, I'm not saying that we should readopt human sacrifices, not what I'm saying, but part of the benefit of that kind of thing is that they put front and center the significance of our own lives, like the fragility of those lives, and they put front and center this particular model of creation. So they put us in touch with the cost of existing and creating and continuing to live. And the claim that I'm making, again, drawing from alchemical and theurgic traditions, in a word, is that by restoring our yeah, ritual participation in particular religious rites through like th that involves symbolic processes. You don't have to take it literally and literally sacrifice humans. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about um, symbolic participation, or what I'm saying is you can connect with the same qualities of divinity in a different and less literal and more symbolic way that still fulfills the whole purpose of those religious rites and rituals, which is to participate in that aspect of divinity, to recognize ourselves in self-sacrifice and incarnation, and in so doing, to become as the gods, to commune with the gods. Finally, Eliade says, such cosmological conceptions reinforce the homology between man and universe. Again, so it's as I was saying, it's sort of like um, Sky Father self-sacrifices and incarnates as man, and Earth Mother self-sacrifices and incarnates as universe. And together we get mankind and its universe, you know, which is like self and world. Or in Henry Corbin, it's like the imaginal, yeah, like the imaginal and then the imaginal world. So our sense of who we are can change, and our sense of the world that we're in can change, and they go together. And that's what is meant by this kind of homology between man and universe, that there's this kind of similar archetype that lies at this sense of the origin of both. Quote, and several lines of thought carry on and develop this homology in various directions. From these conceptions emerges the sexualization of the vegetable and mineral kingdom and of the tools and objects in the surrounding world. So it's a bit of a Freudian turn. We're going to kind of try to avoid Freud a bit, but the next chapter is called The World Sexualized. Eliade finally finishes the direct relation with this sexual symbolism. Indirect relation with this sexual symbolism, we must recall the multiple images relating to the belly of the earth, the mine compared to the uterus, and ores compared to embryos, all of which are images conferring an obstetric and gynecological significance upon the rituals associated with mines and metallurgy. So this is where we get more directly toward this stuff about giving birth, and back to sort of the mythology associated with alchemy proper rather than metalwork. So what does it mean to like intervene in natural processes so as to fulfill the birthing process that nature is supposed to be in the middle of? That's what I'm going to be exploring in chapter 3 of Mircea Eliade, The Forge and the Crucible, Origins and Structures of Alchemy.